As I've talked about before, I really enjoy the Watchmen comic series. While this graphic novel and its adaptation are quite popular, you might not be aware that a series of prequels were produced by DC Comics decades after the original's release. Here I have the very bluntly named Before Watchmen, a nearly 40-issue behemoth of various prequels to the original story. But rather than talk about them all and review them or whatever, I wanted to explain how this all began, what these stories are, and what they say about the entertainment industry beyond the original Watchmen comic, because it's more important than you might think. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, the writer and artist of the Watchmen series, were approached by DC Comics to continue the Watchmen franchise with prequels and sequels. They more or less refused, and the IP wouldn't go anywhere until the early 2010s, when it was announced that a new line of comics titled Before Watchmen would be released, written and drawn by numerous other creators. Gibbons would remain positive to the idea of DC continuing the series and was open to the idea of new creators taking on the franchise, while Moore heavily criticized their decision to revive what was a completed and finished story. Before Watchmen is comprised of several miniseries, following Night Owl, Silk Spectre, Dr. Manhattan, Rorschach, the Comedian, Ozymandias, and even the Minutemen, who were the precursor to the Watchmen group. There's a two-parter on the side character Moloch, a one-shot on the character Dollar Bill, and numerous side stories in between. With all of that said, the question I ask you is, do we really need all of this? Granted, it's a fictional story, so you don't actually need any of it, but what does it really add to the original Watchmen story besides some knowledge about the characters? If it was worth telling these stories, don't you think Moore and Gibbons would have included this backstory in the original Watchmen story, or they would have come back to write it themselves? None of these are rhetorical questions, by the way. I just like to know your thoughts, but that's really what Before Watchmen is leaving me with, which is, why did we make this? In the case of Watchmen, a critique on superhero comics, the choice by DC to revive the series without its original creators and make prequels for just about everybody kind of speaks to the problems of the comics industry, interestingly enough, in similar ways to the original Watchmen story, but through the creation of the books themselves rather than the storytelling. And I have to say, regardless of the varying quality of the stories here, I can't help but feel that this prequel series falls more in line with the corporate greed and money-making side of the comics industry than out of a genuine desire to naturally expand the original story. Part of that greed is the refusal to end superhero stories. You see, with all these ongoing superhero comics, whether it's from Marvel or DC or whatever, just the fact that they never end creates a really interesting situation. Because on one hand, it means that new creators can constantly build upon and expand the stories, taking them in new directions, and that's a great thing. But on the other hand, the fact that these stories will never end, it means that they become bloated, they lose focus of what the story was meant to be, and it inevitably runs into problems with continuity and consistency. Before I end this video, I want to include some of what Alan Moore had to say on Before Watchmen, just to give you guys some more food for thought. Moore criticized the project, calling it completely shameless, and stated that he was not interested in monetary compensation, but rather, what I want is for this to not happen. What the comics industry has effectively said is, yes, this was the only book that made us briefly special, and that was because it wasn't like all the other books. Watchmen was something that stood on its own and had the integrity of a literary work. What they've decided now is, so let's change it to a regular comic that can run indefinitely and have spin-offs, and let's make it as unexceptional as possible. Like I say, they're doing this because they haven't got any other choices left, evidently. To recap everything I've said, I'm not necessarily hating on Before Watchmen. I think it's cool that new creators can expand previous works and make something new. But at the same time, I just think it's a testament to the issue of superhero comics' never-ending stories, the greed of the entertainment industry, and it just kind of loses focus of what Watchmen was about to begin with. I can't blame DC for wanting to do more with this property, but if the original writer was so adamant against expanding it, maybe they should have taken that into consideration. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. Let me know your thoughts on Watchmen, your thoughts on Before Watchmen if you've happened to read it. It's nowhere near as popular as the original, so maybe you haven't, maybe you have. But that's all I've got to say. I'll see y'all next time. Goodbye.